I'm asking you to notice that the very same blue team, which I am saying is for some reason degrading our military readiness, while it is a pay-for-play system with few, if any, safeguards against who buys access, that same thing is also taking actions that are completely inexplicable with respect to school children.
Well, actually, I mean, look, again, I don't know enough to talk about this stuff, but if you're asking why are vaccine, if I were to be asked to accept your premises, like the vaccines, they don't do much of any good, maybe they do net harm, why are they be so widely administered? I would resort to the big pharma explanation, okay? But that's a different question. If I were to accept those premises, that would be my go-to. That would be my go-to conspiracy hypothesis. But that's a different question. I thought we were here to discuss what you claimed on this podcast, which I think is an irresponsible thing to claim in an era. I mean, ask Nancy Pelosi's husband how careful we should be, maybe, before declaring people enemies of the state. That's the environment we're in. And what you said certainly would give people the impression you're suggesting that people in the Democratic administration are enemies of the state. Now you're telling us it's different. I don't buy the what you're saying now doesn't make sense to me either. But please let me get to my next two hypotheses. Please.
I don't understand what conversation we're having. I mean, you specifically say, look, I don't know enough to assess this. I'm saying, look, it's transparent on its face that we are making an error as large as administering a dangerous, highly novel treatment to children who don't need it and won't benefit from it. And for no reason, it would still not be justified if it did block transmission, because it's not reasonable to harm children to save vulnerable old people. But even that explanation has fallen by the wayside. And yet we're still doing it.
I know that's your view.
Robert, this is since my podcast. We are still doing this. The policy marches on, completely divorced from reality.
Right. I know that's your view. But I didn't tweet about that part of your view. I tweeted about your claim that someone is intentionally undermining military readiness via the military vaccine policy. Can we get back to that? Or do you just not want to discuss it?
Cute. It's not that I don't want to discuss it. It's that I do not want you framing it in isolation as if we don't have multiple extremely difficult to explain things happening across many different domains simultaneously. Because the point is, you can say that my hypothesis is irresponsible and maybe even crazy if you can isolate it. But in context, the fact is we are dealing with something that has caused our system to go completely insane. And it is not only going insane, but it is targeting children. Right? You have to look for an explanation big enough to deal with that. Is pharma corruption big enough? Maybe. I accept that as a possible hypothesis. But it is hard to understand why a civilian authority that can recognize that these mandates needed to be lifted for the public still maintains them for the military. What is that? What happened?
Let me just repeat that. For the purposes of the argument I'm making, what you just said doesn't matter, okay? I know you believe that. For the purposes of the argument I'm making, it doesn't matter, let me finish, whether what you just said is true. It does matter to some extent whether what you just said is a view widely shared, like in the Pentagon and in the administration. I'm here to tell you it's not, okay? And I hope there's some logicians out there who understand the argument I'm making and understand that it doesn't rise or fall on whether Bret Weinstein's view of COVID is right. It rises or falls, parts of some of the hypotheses rise or fall on the question of whether Bret Weinstein's view is the view that prevails in America. And you know damn well it doesn't. That's what's, you talk about that all the time. Of course it doesn't prevail.
False. That is logically false because because the hypothesis I advanced is that you have a pay-for-play system in which people aren't paying close attention to what is or isn't good for military readiness or children or the transmission of the disease because they have higher priorities. That's what I'm saying. Actually,
the hypothesis you advance is that some of these people are paying attention to military readiness and want to degrade it.
No.
That's different.
No.
You absolutely did.
Look, no. Because as you read it, you even noticed as you were reading that quote, you said, you, in that case was a foreign entity that might have wished to accomplish these things acting through the blue team.
Right. Okay.
That's the
But you're
hypothesis.
saying somebody wants to undermine military readiness.
Well, look, our military enemies certainly want to undermine our military
But
readiness.
the point is, you're even positing that the people in administration must be indifferent to like good and bad consequences depends on their accepting your view of COVID and vaccines and so on.
No.
And they don't.
They're
don't.
influence peddlers. They're indifferent to our well-being. That's why they're selling us out.
It's possible that they are, but
Oh my
the
God.
assertion that the vaccine policy unambiguously indicates that they are
I didn't say
depends on their
anything about
sharing.
unambiguously. I said hypothesis.
No, let me read you a quote from yours. Whatever it is, you're talking about this entity out there. This is what you said. Whatever it is at the very least completely indifferent to our readiness. It doesn't care if we're at our best, or maybe it wants us unready. Then you also said the absolute least pernicious explanation is total indifference to the well-being of service members and the readiness of our military force. So you're saying there is zero probability that the people responsible for this policy are not indifferent to the well-being of service members and readiness. You're saying there's zero chance. That's the logical meaning of those two statements. Do you agree?
You are playing a shell game because I do believe that whatever engineered the policy has to be at least completely indifferent. That does not mean that the people who made the policy happen are indifferent. I do believe they are de facto indifferent because they are corrupt. They are allowing themselves to be steered by things that have something other than the public's well-being at their core. That is what they're doing. They're doing that for money or power or both. I don't know. But
they're de facto indifferent, not de jure.
Again?
Never mind. I think it's clear in your podcast that you're saying it must be the case. They just don't care about the well-being of service members or the readiness of our military. You said
the policy must be indifferent.
Okay, that's your claim. There's no chance that it could be anything else. Whereas I just, and what you just said is whoever designed the policy. Well, come on, it's very easy to explain how it was implemented.
Now you're playing philosophical games, okay? If I say that we exist and are having a conversation, am I saying there is no chance that one of us is a brain in a jar being fed information to see what we will do? No, I'm not going to technically rule that out. But yes, from the point of view of what plausibly explains the conversation that we are having, you and I are two human beings with a disagreement interacting over the internet. Okay.
Okay.
So I am saying the same thing here. Is it possible? Who knows? Am I a schizophrenic who, imagined that there was something called COVID and that this is all happening in my head? I guess. But I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time worrying about that. What I think I've got is a lot of information about how this system is behaving. None of it makes a whit of sense. It does appear to be rather completely, again, you decide that you get the right to rule out the question of, well, okay, we've got two completely irrational, seemingly indifferent policies in two different realms, right? You don't want to talk about why, even though I'm sure you have enough information to know it makes no sense to administer mRNA vaccines to children for COVID, right?
I literally haven't looked at the data. I'm sorry. I don't have young children. I'm a horrible person for not being conversant in it. I'm sorry. My intuition is if I were a policymaker, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. I agree. It's just not worth the blowback.
What I'm telling you is you're living in a phase of history in which we are actually contemplating mandating of radical therapies that do not benefit the individuals in question without giving informed consent to them, or in this case, their parents, right? We are actually contemplating doing this, even though we know that the risks from these things go heavily to the young, for multiple reasons, both because they're more dangerous to the young and because the young have longer lives ahead of them, and that the benefits go in the opposite direction. If there's any benefit at all to these treatments, they do not go to young people. And yet we're doing it. So my point to you is probably a couple hours work on your part would reveal to you that we have some crazy policy in motion that cannot be explained epidemiologically or medically or logically or any other way, that policy is actually happening, that it's not something that happened and has been slow to be reversed. This is more recent than the podcast you were complaining about. This is taking place. Now, the problem is the level of dysfunction exceeds normal explanations. And what I see you doing is wanting to narrow down the question to exactly one dysfunctional thing and then stretch the hypotheses that you consider reasonable to the extent that they can cover that one thing. And my point is, well, that's not the context they exist in. You're existing in a moment where we have somebody who's president who is exhibiting extreme cognitive decline, which means you and I don't know what's president. It means we've effectively elected a party at best. That party is corrupt, so we don't really know what we've ushered into the executive branch. And we have all of these policies that are emerging that make no sense at all and do appear to emerge from complete indifference to the well-being of Americans.